best answer ever.
Uh-huh. Sure. Yeah, no, I'm gonna go with no. I am also going to point out that I find it very funny that Dan's missing today.
I know.
He had a legitimate excuse.
Well, I didn't think he didn't. I just think it's funny because he loves John Green so much.
Just so you know, I have not finished reading The Fault in Our Stars or seen the movie yet.
Okay, so we're not actually going to talk about that today, apparently.
No.
I know a lot of things that happened in it because of the internet and spoilers, but I'm only in the second chapter. I only started reading it like yesterday, and I was really not in the mood for it, and so
saying haven't exactly finished is kind of understating.
Yeah, a bit. Yeah, I realize. I recognize that.
Okay, so what shall we talk about?
Well, it's kind of like I send out my little letters asking for suggestions.
We can still talk about YA fiction, can't we? And adaptations and like whatever. Okay, well.
I mean, I did the movie, and I have read the book, and I liked them both. I'm not a naturally super sentimental person, so I feel like I'm not really the right audience for that book. But young adult fiction in general is something I love.
Yes.
And I love it. It was really interesting. So I want to talk about young adult fiction this week, partially because the movie just came out, and partially because this week there was that article in Slate about why grown-ups should, in fact, be to read young fiction.
I was thinking about that.
And it made me angry because no.
Yes. No. Well, okay. The short version of my response to that, which I will throw out there right now, is if adults truly are ashamed of reading young adult fiction, should they be allowing teenagers to read it?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the argument that you should be ashamed of it, Patrick, for the record, there's still weird background noise. I think it's coming from you.
I don't hear it.
I don't think it's coming from me.
Let me see if I can watch the live stream and see if it's in that, because I'm using multiple devices because I'm crazy.
Yeah, so the reason I think... What was I even talking about? Oh, so the reason some adults say that you should be ashamed if you're an adult and you read young adult fiction is because there's this presupposition that teenagers are not actually just shorter adults, but are actually, are
sub-adults.
Yeah, it's a different view. Either teenagers are pre-adults or they're late kids. So thinking about, if teenagers are late kids, then why would grown-ups read media made for kids? It's kids media. Whereas if they're, pre-adults, then any literature made for teenagers is made for proto-adults. Personally, I think both of those views are wrong because ultimately teenagers are teenagers. Like, they're neither kids nor adults, but that doesn't make their media bad. Sort of like how I don't think as an adult I should be ashamed of liking Pixar movies, even though I don't actually have kids. I nanny kids, and I am around a lot of children's media as a result, but some of that stuff I just like for me, just because it's...
And nobody... Like, I don't think people really think it's weird when you like Pixar films or animated movies. Like, they're like sort of made for kids, but people don't look at it as exclusively for kids.
Like, it's funny because we don't actually view adults who are super obsessed with Disney and like take vacations down to Disney with all of their adult friends. We don't view them as actually that weird. It's just their thing. Just nothing we do. Whereas we do, apparently, view adults who really like media made for teenagers as super weird, which seems a bad standard.
Yes. Well, because it seems to be,
Seems stupid.
well, going to what the article said specifically, as opposed to generalizations of what it might seem to say, I understood how the author was saying if adults aren't reading anything more grown up than young adult fiction, then what encouragement is there for teenagers to move on to great adult literature? But that's, like, that just I feel like that just has to do with being well read and literate and educated in literature than reading adult fiction that's geared for adults versus geared for teenagers. Like, for example, I read a novel, I don't remember what it was called, it was like, you know, something stupid like Finding Mr. Darcy, but it was targeted at adults. I am ashamed of how much I enjoyed that novel because it was crap. Like, it was not good. It was bad. Anything by John Green is actually better in terms of literary quality than that novel. So it's really like an ambiguous standard, and I don't think it has anything to do with the age of the intent. Well, I think it has less to do with the age of the intended audience than it does with what are you reading, are you thinking about what you're reading, and do you value literature?
Well, and I think actually my big problem with it was that it was making a lot of value judgments about different kinds of literature. Like, this was clearly a writer who values literary fiction. I hate literary fiction. It is terrible. I do not enjoy it. What I hate about it is the fact that nothing happens. I don't want to read a book where nothing happens.
Yes.
In fact, I don't particularly like reading realistic fiction because I have a real life. I don't need narrative form that replicates my life. I have one. We're good. I want to read about robots and zombies and aliens and magic and unicorns. Like, I want to read about stuff that I don't actually get to see. That's why I like travel literature.
Right.
And, like, I want to experience something different when I read. And there was a very strong value judgment in that article. Basically saying, like, if you're not reading literary fiction, then you're not reading good books.
And it pretty much straight up says that.
And a part of what I disagree with that is just like, you know, hey, what if you freaking hate literary fiction, like I do? Or does that mean that I consume no literature of value? Well, I don't think that's true. I think that there's more value in any given Terry Pratchett novel than there is in most of the literary fiction I've read. I don't actually see any value. Whereas in Terry Pratchett, I've learned about the world. I've learned about how people work from Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman. And, yeah, John Green. And heck yes, The Hunger Games. Like, just because they're not representing realistic situations doesn't mean that a given genre isn't still telling you the truth about human society and the way people work. And I dislike the idea that because they feature teenage, usually female protagonists, young adult fiction books are somehow not representing universal truths in the same way that books featuring adult, usually adult male protagonists do. That is a flawed supposition to me. Yeah, I just don't like that. Anybody?
Well, I have not read a lot of literary fiction, because I avoided those classes in college. That makes it sound like I intentionally shied away from them. I did not feel like taking them, and I didn't have to, so I didn't. But I don't hate literary fiction, for the record. I think the best thing I've written to date was a literary short story, because I saw value in focusing only on the characters, and because it was a short story, you're looking at a snapshot, like a turning point, or a turning point for the characters as opposed to the full journey of it. Like, that when you're working with different mediums, obviously you have to pick a thing, and you can't show the whole journey of a character in a short story. So I like, I do value that, and I do think there is value in literary fiction. It's just a really different kind. And so to throw out things that you already know and just don't identify with is that literary fiction will speak to some people a lot more than genre fiction will. I mean, some people just hate genre stuff, which is inconceivable to me, but it exists. It happens. It's weird. But I think I agree that making value judgments based on genre is terrible and a horrible practice because, like, there are so many good genre stories, good genre fiction novels that have shaped the culture massively that this person would have to be discounting if they were going to follow through with their argument. And that's not the article's argument that genre fiction is bad. The argument has to do with the target audience, which I think is actually a more flawed argument than making a value judgment based on genre. Because if you're, and this kind of goes back to what I said at the beginning, if you're saying, oh, well, what our kids read is basically crappy and not worth the investment of adults, then really, why are you letting your kids read that? Mm. Like, I don't want my kids to read crap that doesn't do anything for them. I want my kids to read stuff that challenges them and makes them think. And I mean, that's the whole success point of John Green's novels, is it's not about your average teenager who's just bumming around because society doesn't expect anything from them. It's about teenagers who are weirdly introspective. Are you okay? I just heard a large crash. Anyway, no screams, so I think we're okay. It features teenagers who are, like, weirdly introspective and think about things and talk about things and reflect and, like what she was kind of making fun of what Augustus Waters says about, not denying himself the simple pleasure of telling the truth, something like that. Well, yeah, like when he said the first version of that in the first chapter that I read, I was kind of a little bit like, you're a weird teenager. I don't know if I like you yet. But really, there's something to be said about that. Like, it's presenting a philosophical approach to life that I think is valuable for kids to be thinking about.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think that, well, okay, one of the big things that a lot of people find irritating in young adult fiction is actually one of my favorite things, and I just wrote an article post on this, but it's that so many of the books, especially the ones with teenage female protagonists, are written in first person. Sometimes first person present, which, just from a writing standpoint, like, I remember taking creative writing classes, you're never supposed to do that. That's bad writing. That's bad.
What, writing in first person present tense?
Yeah, that's naughty, and, like, you're basically, I mean, any traditional writing professor is going to tell you not to do that. I actually had a kid in my writing class who, when other students would do that, because that's so prevalent and they're teenagers, they're gonna write like they read, and he would tell them, like, oh, you shouldn't write in first person. It's like, well, of course you should. Why shouldn't you? Second person is a little weird, but even that, like, why not? Do it. Go for it. But
expand the literary world.
What I like about the fact that all these books are written in first person is the fact that it means that we're reading stories being told by the person they're about. And I think there's actually something really powerful about that you don't normally get. Normally stories are told to us by some, like, omniscient thing, like, or we observe them. And that gives us the opportunity to draw our own conclusions about what's going on. And that is very valuable and has a great place. But I think it is equally valuable to have stories where you don't have the opportunity to do that, where you, as a reader, are in someone's head, and your understanding of what's going on in the narrative is entirely colored by this character. And I think it's especially valuable that the characters who are doing this are teenage girls. Mm-hmm. That is not a perspective we get a lot. We talk a lot about teenage girls, but we don't often have the opportunity to hear their stories in their words. And I think that is actually, to me, one of the biggest values of young adult fiction, and why I think adults should read it more. Adults shouldn't be ashamed of it. Adults should read it more, precisely because these are stories that teenage girls relate to, that have teenage female protagonists telling their own stories. And in cases of books like Speak, or The Lovely Bones, or The Fault in Our Stars, they're teenage girls talking about incredibly brutal, traumatic things happening to them, that the story would not be the same and wouldn't be nearly as good if they weren't told by the girls themselves.
Yeah.
If Speak was not narrated by Melinda, it would be a terrible book. Because Speak, for those of you who don't know, Speak by Laurie Halse Anderson is
very good, and you should read it.
It's amazing. It's a book about a teenage girl who you don't really know at the beginning what's going on, but it's pretty easy to figure out if you are at all
sensitive. Have any deductive powers whatsoever?
That she was raped right before the school year started. And when she called the police, she was so nervous and uncomfortable and anxious, and she was so shunned for calling the police that she wasn't even able to report it. And she actually loses the ability to speak. Just psychologically, she stops talking. And it's about her freshman year of high school and her coming to grips with what happened to her and slowly gaining the courage to tell someone that she was raped. And if that book wasn't written in first person, even if we knew all of that, even if we, as the audience, were in sort of a third person omniscient where we knew everything that was happening, it would not be the same as hearing it from her. In her head of her way of dealing with this.
Right.
She represses it, she stops talking, there's a part where she stops eating. Just feeling her trauma in her own words is so much more powerful than it would be to just watch it. And it forces us to confront how she really feels rather than drawing conclusions about her behavior. Because in this book, she was drunk when she got raped. But you don't have the opportunity to even consider blaming it on her because you're in her head.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, honestly, I think the world would be a better place if more people read Speak, personally. But I honestly think that adults should read young adult fiction because these are the people who are going to be the powerful adults in our future. These people are going to be shaping the world. Don't you want to know what stories they love? Don't you want to know what stories are shaping them into the people they're going to be? And don't you want to try and understand who they are? We are the stories we tell, and if you completely discount someone's storytelling apparatus, you effectively erase them from the culture. That's why representation of people of color and women and minorities matters so much. We are the stories we tell.
Yeah, that makes me think so much of a big reason why I think storytelling is important, and that is that it teaches us empathy. It teaches us how to relate to other people. A really well-told story that is well-read shows you a lot about the world and people and relationships. And those are the most valuable stories that impact us. And so you should be reading stories that teach you to do that. And the other thing that is screaming in my head because I talk about it way too much is that I think, yes, adults really should be caring a lot more about what teenagers and kids are thinking and how they're growing up and what they should be doing. And there's just a lot of generational blame that goes on. And I realize this happens with every generation, and that in all likelihood, my generation will be criticizing our kids' generation 20 years from now. That's just going to happen. But I think it's wrong. And I think that our generation should learn from our frustration right now and be better.
Yeah.
And 20 years from now, instead of criticizing the generation for being different than us, recognize how our mistakes have contributed to their faults. And instead of just saying, oh, you're so selfish, you're so entitled, you're too caught up in your phones, maybe get to know them, get down on their, in their world with them and come alongside them and mentor them and teach them how to deal with the world.
Yeah.
this doesn't seem like rocket science. It seems like how to be a good human and a good parent and how to take care of kids. And, like, I realize this is not something that a lot of people think about, but come on.
I mean, to be fair, you are kind of preaching to the choir here.
Yes, seeing as that is your actual job.
Yes, it is.
But, you know, there are other people who watch this who should
true.
be telling all of their friends that they need to. I mean, like, obviously, I don't want everyone to be like, oh, I need to go invest in teenagers' lives and then go and, like, try to invest in teenagers' lives. Like, honestly, not everybody should be doing that. But I think it's something you should at least think about and care about and wonder if this is something that you should really be doing, is taking up a mentorship role in the lives of younger people. Because,
well, I think just in general, I think it is very important to consider the impact that you have on younger people.
yes, certainly consider the impact.
Active mentorship role. At some point, you interact with someone younger than you.
Right. Yes, definitely think about the impact. Oh, and if you're a parent, you don't have a choice. You have to do this.
Yeah.
And if you're an older sibling, you don't have a choice. Like, these are just simple things. Like, I don't, being aware of my younger siblings does not shape everything I do, but it is something that I think about. Sometimes I think, what would happen if I did X, Y, Z? And one of the things that makes me think, I mean, I don't really want to do X, Y, Z, but I definitely won't ever, is because of the impact it would have on my younger siblings and how they would feel seeing their older sister doing such and such a thing. Or, you know, like, I think about these things. I think about it a lot.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I don't have younger siblings. I am the baby. But I mean, actually, specifically from your family, I know that, like, you know, I get you into a TV show, and then 3 weeks later, your little brother is telling me, like, hey, are you up on the latest episode of this TV show? Like, it's just funny for me to watch. Like, it's such a quick turnaround.
It is very quick. It used to be because they didn't have profiles on Netflix, and I wouldn't even have to tell them I was watching a show. They would see it in the recently watched. We'll start watching it.
But that's just a silly example. But it definitely matters. It is noticeable. So, yeah, no, I so think it matters. Yeah, and I mean, just. Sorry, going back to one other point that woman made in her article that I actually deeply disagreed with was that teenage literature, young adult fiction, by virtue of being young adult fiction, is inherently more simplistic. I think that's crap. I don't know if I reading that article, I kind of felt like that woman hadn't talked to a teenager in a very long time, because I'm like, I'm sorry, good young adult fiction, stuff that resonates with teenagers, has to be complex. Have you ever talked to a teenager for 15 minutes? They will give you 15 different emotional reactions in those 15 minutes, and they will all be equally valid. And this goes for boys and girls.
Yeah, life is complex. Life is always complex, but life is really complex as a teenager, because that's when you're first starting to realize just how complex life is, and that it's going to only get more complex in some ways.
Yeah, and it's funny because, like, as a youth leader, I am on a very regular basis in contact with approximately 100 teenagers. That's not actually an overestimation. I would say that's pretty much about 100 teenagers, and of those, about 20 of them on a really regular basis. So I feel like I've got a good basis for understanding how it is to interact with teenagers. And honestly, one of the things I love is that I love watching them slowly start to mature and, like, take on more responsibility. But it's interesting watching the first time a teenager is like, I need to get a job. Well, then, how do I even get a job? And then having them, you know, I used to, like, get really annoyed when my students would tell me, I'm so busy. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I have 3 jobs. And also I volunteer with you ungrateful jerks 10 hours a week, and, like, all this stuff, and just I would get really annoyed. But now I realize, like, oh, right. The reason you have no time is because this is the first time you have strong responsibilities. Like, this is the time you have withdraws on your time. You're learning the skills that I'm using now. And so I want them to learn how to figure out what they want to do with their lives and who they want to be, and like trying on different identities and taking them off and figuring out what they're doing. Heck, yes, it's complex.
Yeah. And I think, like, I'm fresh enough out of a college, which is like stage 2 of high school, if we're going to be really honest, where I remember getting angry because adults were telling me, oh, welcome to life, you're going to be busy forever. I would complain about how busy I am, and they would just be like, oh, that's the way life is going to be. And I would be really angry. I'm like, you know what? I don't want life to be like this forever. If this is what life is like, I don't want it. I'm going to change it. I'm going to do something different because I hate this. I mean, that's a little bit dramatic. I always did that when I was mad because I didn't actually hate school, which is why I kind of tried to go back.
And it's also funny, Elizabeth, because, like, you say, like, I always used to do that. You still do that.
I do. I do. And I thought that, you know, like, oh, I don't want to be this busy. And then I spent the first 6 months out of graduation, after graduation, being like, oh, I have so much time at night. I could just cook dinner and read books and watch TV. And then, like, I edited sound for a feature-length film and started writing another novel and joined a MOOC that I didn't have time to finish. And, like, you know, I started doing martial arts. Like, I add things because I do like it, but I didn't realize that. And it's the same thing, though, of, like, you're figuring out how to do it. Like, now, at least when I complain about being busy, I know that it's entirely my own doing. And that everything that is making me busy is something I want to be doing, to some, you know, for one reason or another. And that's what wasn't really communicated from the adults in the real world to the new adults in college, is that yes, you're probably going to be really busy for the rest of your life, but it's different because you get it. Like, it's different. And I'm sure when I'm 30, I will look back on my 20s and have a new iteration of these reflections.
Well, yeah, because, I mean, it's something where, well, it's like learning how to do anything. You get better at it as you go. I think 2 years ago, if I looked at my life now, I would want to cry and pass out. Because I do a lot of things.
Uh-huh.
A lot of things. I occasionally want to cry and pass out now.
Yeah.
Which is actually what I was doing last week instead of crossover.
Working on your paper?
I just got to.
Because you just finished it.
I cannot. I can't even. I've lost the ability to can, and I just fell asleep, and I slept for like 5 hours.
Wow.
Anyway, my burnout aside. But no, your capacity to be busy is constantly increasing. And it's hard to look at a teenager and be like, you're in public high school. And, like, I get that you have homework, but let's be real.
Yeah. It changes, too. Like, your capacity for being busy is increasing, but also changing. Because when I was in college, I ran on 6 hours of sleep all the time, and I can't do that anymore.
But also, I mean, like, I just, you know, it's like, okay, you're in high school and you have a part-time job that you do like 8 hours a week, and like you have one extracurricular activity, and you're looking at me and telling me that you're so busy and you can't cope. And I have to stop and go, you know what? You are. Like, you are busy to the capacity that you are capable of being busy.
Right.
And I have to like stop and remember that before I just slap people.
It's also a good life lesson, not just for teenagers, but for all people, because I spent like a big chunk of my time in film school feeling like a bad film student because I couldn't do everything that such and such other star student was doing. But that's just because I don't have the same capacity for stuff as that person who I'm sure will go on to do great and amazing things.
Well, and I mean, we occasionally get into this in our conversations where I'm like complaining about what I'm doing, and you're like, ah!
I could never do what you do.
But that's okay. We're very different people.
Yes, I know this. I realize this.
I'm glad glad you realized this because it was a little shaky there for a while. But yeah, no, it's just it's important to recognize that. And I don't know. I know that I'm kind of a special case because I love teenagers and I willingly spend a huge amount of my life hanging out with teenagers. Like, I was late today because I was at a graduation party for a teenager, and I'm going to another one after this because it's graduation weekend, and I was at one on Saturday, and like that's what I do with my life.
Yep.
All of my friends can't drive after midnight. But I just get really sad when people discount the stories that teenagers find affecting.
Yes.
Whatever kind of story that is. And for the record, I know teenagers who read literary fiction. Actually, one of my students, it was really funny. It was the beginning of the year. We went around, and it was basically like, hey, so what was, like, the story about in the last book you read? So I made them say, like, what was the last book you read? About 7 out of 12 of them had most recently read The Hunger Games, which was hilarious. Like, it was just... And so they were all... And so we ended up having to be like, okay, what other books have you read? We've done 3 Hunger Games. We're doing something else now. But I had a student who I was like, so what's the last book she read? And you read, and she was like, The Chosen by Chaim Potok.
Oh, that's a good book.
I'm sorry, what? You voluntarily read a piece of literary fiction about the plight of the Jews in the 20th century. What? You're 16! I'm like, and others, she just come in and she'd be like, oh yeah, I just read My Name is Asher Lev. Or,
dude, I read all those books when I was like 17. They were awesome.
But I'm just sitting there and being like, are you freaking kidding me?
Yeah.
When I was 17, I was trying to read everything Anne McCaffrey had ever written because dragons. So I mean, but also, I remember that when I was 17, I read a ton of W. Somerset, or Mom. I read a ton of Mom books, and I'm murdering his name. But, like, The Painted Veil and The Razor's Edge and all those books. And I really, really loved those books. And, like, I actually read a fair amount of, like, I read a lot of Vonnegut. Mm-hmm. I read a lot of Heinlein. Like, I read a lot of the classics of my chosen types. And just thinking, you know, I think we're overestimating as well how much teenagers really care what the adults around them are reading.
Yes.
Yeah, like, I mean, my parents are big readers, but they don't read the same kind of books I read. They've never read the kind of books I read. My dad likes to read books about architecture.
My dad has read, like, every book on leadership there is. I don't care.
Yeah, and, like,
I don't care if I'm not going to read about it.
My mom reads books on storytelling, and like my mom and I actually share some books back and forth, but it's different. And I mean, my ability to relate to my dad is not negated by the fact that I like books with zombies in them and he likes books about how to build a sailboat. That's not like, that doesn't mean we can't talk, and that doesn't mean that I felt that there was nothing that I could read because my parents weren't reading the same kind of books I wanted to read.
Right.
And I actually remember having a role model who did read the kind of books I wanted to read. I just kind of found them. Like, and this was even before the internet was really a thing.
Yeah, that's kind of the same way I found books too.
I mean, I just walked into the library and there was this awesome wall of books where the sticker on the label had a picture of a spaceship. And I was like, hey, that looks like something I want to read. There's a spaceship on these ones, and there's a unicorn on these ones, and I am going to read all of them.
Yeah, basically.
And that's it. And like,
there's some value to that, gotta say. There's some value to walking into a library and just picking a book up and looking at it. Don't judge a book by its cover. Also, is not a completely accurate statement. It's a good No, it's not an accurate statement. There are some good books with bad covers, but there are also some bad books with bad covers.
Well, I mean, and I think that's an interesting statement just in general, because, I mean, okay, we use that as like a metaphor for like, don't judge people by what they look like on the outside.
Right.
Judge them, but it's usually like a pretty decent indicator.
It's a useful tool for understanding things about a person, or it can be, and it does. Yeah. Anyway, that's a whole nother conversation that I don't necessarily know.
Again, I
want to, but
all the time, and you know what? It is incredibly useful to look at a teenager and see what they're wearing. Like, honestly, I do judge because that tells me how they relate to other teenagers.
It does. It tells you, like, how a person dressed tells you, it may not tell you much about their personality or their values or anything like that, but it does tell you something about how they relate to other people.
Mm-hmm.
It really does. Like, that's because I was recently at WeirdCon, which is primarily a LARPing con. I don't do LARPing, but my friends at the table there, and Jim Butcher was there. So I was there, and I was like, why is it that so many of the people who do LARPing, when they are wearing their regular clothes, it's like, you know, the shirt that's buttoned all the way up to the neck, and let's go grossly stereotypical here and say, like, the sweater vest and the pants that are too short with the white athletic socks. You know, like the stereotypical geek. Now, this is not all LARPers, by the way. I've seen a wide variety. But I'm like, why is it that the people fall into categories according to dress? Like, those people will be, you know, the computer geeks or whatever. Yeah. And my friend's response was, well, I think it's because they don't really care what, like, society at large, like the fashionable community or whatever, thinks about how they dress. That's not a concern for them. And that, you know, that rings true. Like, a lot of people I know who don't dress in a particularly fashionable way, just, they're preoccupied with other things. They're way more concerned about reading the all the award winners for a certain genre of book, or, you know, writing a new computer program, whatever. Like, I'm using super stereotypical examples here, which is kind of bad, but,
like, you know, I know a student who did show horse stuff.
Yeah.
And she did not, or I have another student who, she is, like, state champion in 4-H. She wears, like, basketball shorts and a tank top pretty much everywhere because she does not give a crap. Like, she has more important things to think about, like state awards.
Right.
And so, I don't know, I find it really interesting how, anyway, that we got off on a big tangent, but...
We did get off on a big tangent because I was saying that it's fun to look at books in the library.
I want to stop for a second and say, Patrick, you haven't said anything this entire time. Is it perhaps because this is not your subject?
I do not read a lot of young adult fiction, but I do have kind of an opinion on it, in that I don't think we should really even have a label young adult fiction.
Why? But I'm not saying I disagree. I'm more just saying, like,
because it seems weird. It just seems like a weird thing to even have, like, to specifically say, like, hey, this is all for the young adults. But really, like, when you think about it, a lot of books can traverse, like, age groups.
Yeah.
As they are doing.
Yeah.
No, that's a good point, though. I'm just thinking about this in terms of, like, so I really love the Tamara Pierce books because they're about magic and quests and dragons and stuff, and they feature female protagonists. So, whew. But almost every single one of them, they're all female teenage protagonists, but I have never thought of those books as being young adult, probably because I started reading them when I was, like, 20. So I don't think of them as being young adult, but I think technically they are, but no, that's a really good point, is, like, I I don't think of those books as being young adult, even though I suppose they are, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't change my enjoyment of them, and it doesn't change who they're appropriate for.
I think it's a marketing ploy.
It is.
Like that it was invented for that reason.
Yeah, I actually remember at the library. I was working at a library between 2002 and 2005, I think. Basically, I worked at the library all through high school because I'm exactly that much of a nerd, and is that I worked at the library with my then boyfriend. Oh. It's so cute. I was a much better employee than he was. But I remember when we instituted a young adult section. Like it was early in when I worked there that we were building the young adult section. We built the young adult section, and we ended up actually hiring a young adult librarian.
Interesting.
But it was interesting because that was like 2002. That was 12 years ago. That's really recent.
I actually have a good friend from college, and he works at a library, and that is his whole job. He is in charge of the young adult section.
Yeah. And it's interesting to stop and be like, that's actually a super recent development. The acceptance of young adult as a separate genre. Now, it's always kind of been like a subgenre, or I suppose it's more like this. Young adult fiction has always been a genre along the lines of science fiction or fantasy. Like, it's a thing, but it's a book. It's a book with complex words and not any pictures, so it goes over here. Whereas recently, it's become an entire different section.
Yeah.
Like, that's what I would say is different. Like, now, so I'll actually put this in terms of Barnes & Noble. Because I noticed this at my Barnes & Noble. When I was in high school and I went to Barnes & Noble, I would immediately gravitate towards the science fiction and fantasy section because nerd, and all of the science fiction and fantasy books would be there. Now, there is a young adult section, and there is a young adult science fiction and fantasy section, and a young adult romance section. And then there's also a romance section and a science fiction and fantasy section, which I think is weird. Like, the only difference is the ages of the protagonists.
Basically. Yeah,
That's
basically. I mean, I just finished the Keys to the Kingdom series by Garth Nix. Features a 12-year-old protagonist. I think that technically makes it middle grade fiction. Or maybe, like, the bottom edge of YA fiction. It was really good. I would recommend it to anyone. Pretty much.
I mean, when Harry Potter first started coming out, it was just in the fantasy section.
I was just thinking of Harry Potter because, I mean, if you read the first two books, those are kind of for kids.
Yeah.
And the last two books, that's straight up young adult fiction.
Well, I mean, that's almost straight up adult fiction.
Yeah.
I know parents who've actually told their kids that they have to stop at 3 and they have to wait until they're 16 to read 4, 5, 6, and 7 because just the themes in them are so much stronger. Now, I don't actually agree with that because I think
it's just interesting because it's all one series, but you could technically put these books in one section and these books in another section, and it's all the same story.
Yeah, and I think that's really the value of the Harry Potter books. Sorry, to go on a specific thing, is that what I love about the Harry Potter books is that each book increases in its maturity level in concordance with the age of the kids.
Yes.
Which I think is brilliant.
Yes.
I also think that makes life a little more difficult. But I also think it makes differentiations like this stupid. Because I know a lot of adults who read Harry Potter. I know multiple adults who are in the process of rereading the Harry Potter series right now.
I didn't start reading it until second year of college, which does not, well, it depends on how you're defining adult, but still.
Were you an adult then?
Whenever the fourth book came out is when I started reading.
I read them 2 days before the first movie came out because I really wanted to read them before we saw the movie. So I read the first 2 books one each day, the days before the first movie came out, and then I went to
2001.
what?
2001 is when the first movie came out.
Yep, I was 13 and in freshman year of high school, and we went to see it with my drama class on a field trip, and it was amazing. And I saw the movie, and then I came home, and it was Thanksgiving weekend, and I read the other 2 books. There were only 4 out yet. I read the other 2 books over that weekend, and then I was in agony until I think it was that summer or like the summer after when the 5th book came out. But yeah, anyway.
I remember anxiously anticipating the 5th book. I was like outside on the porch at my parents' house in Rhode Island, waiting for the UPS driver to come up and to deliver the book.
I went to the midnight party for the 6th and 7th books, but actually for the 5th book, I want to say what I did. I don't remember where I was, but for whatever reason, I made my mother drive me to CVS at like 7 o'clock on Saturday morning, because they always came out on a Friday night, and we bought one. And then I just read it.
The cruel thing is that I remember later that day going to the grocery store, and there was just a bunch of them right there.
Exactly. No, I mean, like, I did the midnight showing for the other, but it was really dumb, because I could have just gone to CVS. But the midnight releases were actually super fun, just for the camaraderie. Like, you go in costume, and you're there, and everyone else there is super excited to be there.
Yeah, I remember it was pretty cool. I went to... Never mind.
Well, actually, that made me think of another little subgenre that I want to put on about young adult fiction. One of the other things I really value in young adult fiction, and also genre fiction, as opposed to something like literary fiction, is the fact that it's very community-oriented. You enjoy it communally. I don't know literary fiction as well, because it's just not my thing. And also I've read a lot of bad literary fiction, which I think is why I hate it. But I haven't observed as much of a community, and just as much of a community with adult fiction in general. It's not as community-based, whereas young adult fiction really is.
Even the ones that are about boys, which I thought of because of the slippery slope of suck for urban fantasy, that post, where you talk about how male protagonists basically end up increasingly isolated, whereas female protagonists have an increasingly expansive social support system in these kinds of stories.
Yeah, in fantasy and science fiction, that's usually what happens.
Right, and it's bad for men. That's why they're all lonely.
Oh my gosh, reading the Harry Dresden books eventually gets kind of painful, because you're like, how much more can your life suck?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's why he actually, when I went to the Q&A with Jim Butcher, he actually said that he prefers to switch off between working on a Dresden book and working on something completely different, because otherwise he just gets tired of it and starts making Harry's life increasingly horrible.
Yeah, you can tell.
And that's why he killed him and wrote a book from somebody else's point of view.
Yep. That is the thing that happened.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I find it interesting because there is such a strong community. I mean, and occasionally it's a community that actually scares me a little bit, because I review a lot of young adult books on my blog, and definitely the most angry, the hands down angriest fan community that I've offended is the fan community of Disney movies. I know, like, it's fine if adults like Disney movies, like, as an idea, I'm totally okay with that, but adults who like Disney movies are freaking terrifying when you offend them. Because they will call you a racist in the most imaginative ways. Anyway, that's a side note of my personal trauma and how many people hate me now. But young adult fans are...
I don't get that, because never mind. Carry on.
I know, Disney movies are all about the love. But,
they're terrible. And it's becoming increasingly well known. Anyway, carry on. We're not going to talk about this.
Young adult fans, it's like young adult fans and hardcore comic book fans are definitely the next tier down of people who, if you piss them off, are terrifying and vicious. Like, I'm a little afraid to post my review of The Fault in Our Stars, not because I hated it, but because there are one or two things I think they could have done better, and I'm kind of afraid that I'm going to get hate mail. And when I say kind of afraid, I mean 95% sure. So that's going to be fun.
Yeah.
You want to up those numbers, just mention how Shailene Woodley did this instead of Mary Jane, and then you'll get 100% hate mail. Guarantee.
Yeah. To be fair, though, I'm okay with that choice. She was very well cast. For the record, the movie is quite good. I have a couple of quibbles with it, but that's because I'm me, and I wouldn't be me if I didn't have quibbles.
You have quibbles about everything.
I have quibbles.
This is a known. It is known.
Yeah. It is known. Yeah, no, I don't like things without having feelings about how they could be better. With, like, one or two exceptions. Yeah. I can't actually think of anything that I would change about Bend It Like Beckham.
Yeah, I was just going to say. I've almost read your entire blog.
You really have, and it's very impressive.
There's a few from like your first year that I haven't read because I wasn't checking it like while you were posting those, and those were all like ones that I have to go back and read. But certainly everything you've posted in the last 2 years I have read, and shockingly I remember most of it.
Which is a little scary, but also kind of funny. No, the problem is because I've so clearly documented my tastes. On the plus side, it's great because it's stuff like my parents know that I don't happen to have a copy of Chariots of Fire, and so they buy one for me because they know that I love it and all that, and that's great. But the downside is that if you ever change your opinion, it's like a huge stinking deal because everyone knows your opinion, and so you have to formally change it.
That's funny.
And it's really annoying. Anyway. I had to do that with Boondock Saints. I had to formally change my opinion, and it was like a thing. Anyway.
I want to watch Bend It Like Beckham.
Bend It Like Beckham is so good, and I love it.
I do not have a copy of it.
I do, but it's
and I tried to buy one on Amazon, and they didn't have any.
Hey, when you're here in July, I will probably have brought my copy home with me, and you should come over and watch it.
Okay, wait. I may not have time. It depends on what day I'm coming back, because I may be coming back the day before we leave the country. So, we'll see. We'll work it out.
Okay. Anyway, I think we've pretty much exhausted this topic.
We finally talked about YA fiction, guys!
Yes, we can no longer make a joke about it.
A new joke will present itself.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sure. Sure there'll be something else.
There will be. Sorry I didn't have my name title on this one. I can't figure out how to add it on an iPad.
That's Elizabeth. She is the blog.
In case you didn't know.
Elizabeth.
Tune in next week for the title, possibly. But
yes.
I'm going to just stop.
Okay.
So next week we'll be talking about something.
Yeah, exactly.
Until then.
Bye.
Crossover Appeal, episode 86.